everyone. Welcome. We'll just wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join us and get started soon. Just wait another 30 seconds to get started. All right, let's get started. Ani Buzu Sego, and welcome to our launch focused on Northern and rural Ontario. This is, I believe, our fourth launch, and we're excited for everyone who was able to join us. My name is Rico Gupta. I'm the Executive Director of LGBT YouthLine. I use they, them pronouns. To get us started, I wanted to name that this event that's happening today and the land that we work on and live on throughout Ontario is colonized land and is home to many Indigenous territories. I, as well as YouthLine's head offices, are situated in Tekaronto, which is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Shivani, did you just want to move to the next slide for folks who might benefit from text? We offer our gratitude and solidarity to the Indigenous people who have and continue to care for, protect, and defend this land. Although it's important to acknowledge the land, it's only a first step. We're all treaty signers and are thus responsible and accountable for the violence that Indigenous people face. Colonialism is ongoing and Indigenous land and people still continue to be attacked. Today, as we have conversations about the Do Better report, it's important to name that institutions, including 2SLGBTQ organizing, in Ontario and Northern Ontario and throughout Turtle Island have a long and violent history of anti-indigeneity and colonization. As we continue to work to support 2SLGBTQ youth, it's important for us to acknowledge the ongoing harm through the systems we work in and take action to decolonize our work and spaces. This includes supporting Indigenous movements across Ontario and grassroots movements, many of which are led by Two-Spirit, queer, trans, Indigenous youth. I'm especially excited for today's panel as the entire Northern Rural Ontario panel is a group of amazing Two-Spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous folks. Some housekeeping before I pass it on to Haley, just that this is a webinar format, so you won't be visible or be able to use the chat window, but you can use the Q&A to reach us for any technical issues. And then Chrisia, who's doing our tech support, is also adding some notes in the chat window of how to use closed captioning and different features. And I will pass it on to you, Haley.
Hello, folks. So welcome. We're happy you can join us for our fourth webinar of Do Better. We're focusing specifically on Northern and rural context today, and we have the best speakers over the next hour, which I'm going to get to in a second. But first, hi, my name's Haley. I use she, her pronouns. I'm coming from Osage and Ojibwe territory, Gitchin and Mukwadong, or Owen Sound. I work at YouthLine as the Manager of Engagement and Partnerships. And I was just saying behind the scenes too that we haven't had any tech hiccups yet, but I'm thinking that there might be something happening with the slideshow. So Shivani, if you wanted to just close the slideshow for now, and I can kind of do a YouthLine intro and then share screen again shortly when we do the recommendations, that might work for us. So sorry, folks. So just a short introduction to YouthLine for folks that don't know who we are. So LGBT YouthLine is a 2S LGBTQ plus youth-led organization that affirms and supports the experiences of youth who are 29 and under across Ontario. We have been in operation for 27 years, and we offer multiple different programs, including an anonymous peer support line, a resource database, and multiple 2S LGBTQ plus leadership programs. So just going to provide a run through of the agenda. So we only have 1 hour together, but we have a lot to share. So first, we're going to start with a quick overview of the 7 recommendations presented by Anu and myself. After that, we'll be moving into the 2SLGBTQ youth panel presentation, where brilliant members of our communities will share their thoughts and recommendations specifically in relation to the context of rural and northern communities. So that will take the majority of our time together, about a half an hour. And then finally, we'll move into a question and answer period where you folks as the audience members can ask us questions. And like Burka said, you can just use the question and answer chat function at the bottom of your screen to ask us questions. Just to note that this is our 4th webinar. We've noticed from the first 3 that we usually only have time for like 1 to 2 questions. So we're sorry we won't be able to get to all of them, but we're going to try our hardest to kind of consolidate some of those questions and maybe do some follow-up afterwards. So I'm going to provide a super quick history of this report before we get into each of the recommendations. So in February 2020, LGBT YouthLine released results from our 2SLGBTQ plus youth needs assessment, and it was called We're Here, 2SLGBTQ plus youth across Ontario assert needs and experiences. So one of our leadership programs, Provincial Youth Ambassador Project, led the needs assessment and was able to gather responses from almost 1,200 youth throughout Ontario. Based on the needs assessment reports launched in 2020, our team began to imagine recommendations for how to move forward. The demands of the youth from the needs assessment were clear. We need change in Ontario. We need services, supports, all sectors, all politicians, those in positions of power to do better, because 2SLGBTQ plus youth deserve better. Which brings us to a report that you can see here. So 2SLGBTQ plus youth recommendations for change in Ontario. So Anu and I are going to be sharing each of the recommendations over the next 10 minutes. I'm going to start with the first one, but first I wanted to introduce the amazing Anu. So Anu, if you wanted to turn on your camera now. So Anu has been with us since the very beginning of this research project in 2019 as the lead research consultant supporting YouthLine staff and youth ambassadors in the original 2SLGBTQ plus youth needs assessment and taking the lead on the recommendations report. She's been an integral part of the team, pouring so much time and energy every step of the way. So Anu and I are going to be flipping back and forth, reading the recommendations and just sharing a bit of context. So we can move into, if the slideshow is working now, we can move into recommendation number 1. So redesign health system services and programs for 2S LGBTQ plus youth, especially mental health services and care for trans youth. Healthcare is failing 2S LGBTQ young people. We're disproportionately impacted by health-related issues, and we're not getting the support that we deserve, especially within the context of COVID. And it's incredibly difficult and oftentimes impossible to receive 2S LGBTQ plus specific healthcare within rural and northern contexts, which means that many youth have to leave their communities to access healthcare, and many other youth just don't receive healthcare, period. 2S LGBTQ plus youth deserve healthcare and access to healthcare. And I'm going to pass it on to recommendation 2 to Anu.
Gratitude, Haley. Greetings, folks. Anu or Anuradha. My pronouns are she and her. It's a real honor to be here as a consultant to support the process all the way, and you are in for a very lovely conversation after Haley and I go through the recommendations. Recommendation number 2 is that in suburbs, smaller cities, towns, and on reserves, intentionally dedicate resources, that is space, time, energy, and funding to directly support 2S LGBTQ youth. For 2S LGBTQ plus youth, where you're located in Ontario makes a huge difference in terms of services, programs, finding and building community, and more. We know that some urban centers in Ontario are very well resourced, and that's been very clear during the pandemic. I want to share with you 2 quick quotes that came out of the needs assessment process that informed thinking through this recommendation, and they're both from youth in Northern Ontario. So one quote is, social networking opportunities and events outside of Pride Month. I say this in the 2 months leading up to Pride, where sometimes in some community spaces, it's only in June where people get spaces, time, and energy to build together. And another youth had an opportunity to say, we would like smaller community events that can eventually lead into larger groups where you feel more comfortable. Throughout the needs assessment and the recommendations development process, there were many conversations about so much of the narrative about 2S LGBTQ youth in Ontario is still focused on youth in urban settings. I'm from the suburbs, and I would say, even the suburbs get left out, but not to the extent that smaller communities, northern communities, rural communities, and as well as communities that are reserve communities get left out of that conversation. I really appreciated the examples people shared about what needs to change. And so that's a recommendation for you to look at the website so you can see through all of the ideas.
Recommendation 3, develop mechanisms for grassroots 2SLGBTQ+ youth organizing to access much needed resources and supports. So in our 2019-2020 needs assessment, we asked youth how they look after their mental health. Their responses: 2SLGBTQ youth look after each other and they looked after themselves. A 2SLGBTQ young person is way more likely to seek support from a friend than they would a social service agency. So what does this mean in terms of funding? Provide funding for 2SLGBTQ young folks. They know what they need. They're already doing it. Give them the funding so they can continue doing the work that they're doing. Give them their funding so that they can live, so they can build community. And within the context of rural and northern settings, give them the funding so they can stay.
Recommendation number 4 is about the meaningful involvement of 2SLGBTQ+ youth, especially racialized and Indigenous 2SLGBTQ+ youth, in decision-making at the local, regional, and provincial levels. Tokenism is simply not what 2SLGBTQ+ youth want, need, or deserve. This feeling that many of us are having right now, that the government may not be caring about what we need, this is something that so many 2SLGBTQ+ youth said in the needs assessment. The actual needs assessment happened before the pandemic, but even then there were comment after comment after comment, feeling like those in power don't actually care about what 2SLGBTQ youth want or what they could be participating in or making happen. This recommendation is an opportunity to change things up. What would it look like to have youth not just at the table, but to truly honor the 2SLGBTQ+ youth perspective?
Recommendation 5, proactive efforts to increase 2SLGBTQ+ youth representation in positions of power and influence. So again, going back to our needs assessment, in 2019, I remember going through the raw data from our needs assessment where almost 1,200 youth responded. One of our final questions was, if you could say anything to folks in positions of power, what would you say? By far, one of the top responses was, stop making decisions without us. Stop thinking you know what's best for us. Create space for us at the table. Why are cis, white, straight people making decisions about our lived reality? Over and over and over again. It seems like the recommendation is pretty clear then. Create spaces for 2SLGBTQ+ youth to be in decision-making positions, not tokenized positions like Anu said, but positions where youth can actually make decisions, where they can put things in place, where they can say how things happen. So if you're in a position of power, use your position to advocate for youth decision-making power, advocate to set things up differently, not just in terms of the political sphere, but also within each of your organizations.
Recommendation number 6 is to mandate changes in building and facility standards to have safe, accessible, all-gender washrooms in all public spaces in Ontario, including on reserves. This is simply about safety. The lack of all-gender washrooms in public spaces creates unsafe situations for 2SLGBTQ+ youth, and they said that hundreds of times in the needs assessment process and throughout the recommendations development process. It's beyond time for this to change. Gender identity and expression were added to the Ontario Human Rights Code in 2012, and we're almost 10 years past that time. Yet public spaces like schools and community centers and much more continue to fail 2SLGBTQ youth. We specifically talked about all gender washrooms on reserves, recognizing that there's gaps in safety for Indigenous 2SLGBTQ+ community members, but also pointing to the fact that funding for infrastructure is seriously missing or lacking due to structural gaps from the provincial and the federal government. This recommendation is one that you probably think is very clear, but we actually need more will to make this happen.
And our final recommendation, recommendation number 7, comprehensive and ongoing training and capacity building focused on supporting 2SLGBTQ+ youth and challenging homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and racism. So I mentioned earlier that in our needs assessment, 2SLGBTQ young folks stated that they rely on themselves and each other before they reach out for support from organizations or services. So there's a reason for this. The social service sector, the education sector, the healthcare sector, all of the sectors create so much harm. The violence that young people experience and navigate on their own is terrifying. Any 2S LGBTQ person can name countless stories of how they've been harmed by different sectors in Ontario. And you know what that means? Youth stop reaching out. They stop coming. The cycle of relying on themselves and each other continues. One of the ways that this can be mitigated is through ongoing training across all organizations in all sectors. Trainings that explore homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and how it intersects with racism, with disability, with class. These trainings need to be continuous and tailored to your specific workplace and or sector. They should be facilitated by folks from 2S LGBTQ communities, particularly by folks who are gender diverse, racialized, or disabled. Commit to this recommendation. It's so straightforward. Write it into your budget. And if you don't have control over the budget, send this report to those who do. So that wraps up our 7 recommendations. A lot to unpack there. We encourage everyone, please check out the Do Better website. It provides so much context, it provides examples, it provides so many youth quotes. It's just a really amazing resource, so please check that out. So moving into the next part of our webinar, I'm so excited to learn from the incredible panel of 2S LGBTQ young folks who are here to share their thoughts about the recommendations, specifically in relation to northern and rural contexts. The 3 individuals that make up this panel have actually been involved in some way, shape, or form since the very beginning of the needs assessment in 2019. So first, I'm very excited to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Teddy Saret. So Teddy is a freelance Two-Spirit advocate and storyteller. Their work in Indigenous queer advocacy provides them the opportunity to share their message with diverse audiences across Turtle Island. Their goals are to be 24-hour active resource for queer and Indigenous folks who don't have any supports or routes to information or services. Teddy wants to be the helper that they needed as a young, queer, gender fluid youth. And Teddy is a fabulous Anishinaabe person from Batchewana First Nation. So I'd like to introduce Teddy, also to say that Teddy is like one of YouthLine's biggest fans, and us in turn are one of Teddy's biggest fans. So I'm super excited for what they're going to share with you, and I'm going to pass it over to them to bring out our panelists. Thanks, Teddy.
Chimigwish Haley and Chimigwish YouthLine for inviting me here today to be your moderator. I'm very honored to be here. As always, I'm very grateful to be a part of LGBTQ of LGBT YouthLine in some ways, in some capacity. And thank you so much for sharing that report. It's always good to reflect and think about those times and what that information was, and how we can be moving forward in a good way. And one of those ways is to listening to the voices of the community. So I want to introduce some of the voices that you'll be listening to today and hearing about their experiences living in rural and northern communities, and also identifying as either Two-Spirit or LGBTQ. So first, we have Rico Morales, he, him, they, them. Rico is of Ojibwe and Salvadorian heritage. He was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, but grew up in the central western provinces of Canada and southern United States, Arizona, New Mexico, Mississippi, and Florida. They are Two-Spirit and traditional. Their clan is the Bear, and his spirit name is Little Bald Eagle. Rico currently works for an Indigenous child welfare agency for the past 4 years. He enjoys sushi, boating, and travel. They own the cutest tabby cat in the world named Percy. Rico is currently situated in Dryden, Ontario. Welcome, Rico. You're muted, Rico. Sorry.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, thank you, Rico. Our next panelist we have is Katrina Pleasant, they, them. Katrina is an Indigenous youth living in North Bay, Ontario, who enjoys walking with their dogs, kayaking, and advocating for northern and rural communities. Welcome, Katrina. So good to see you today. Yay. So we're going to jump right in. We do have some questions for the panelists that we have, and I will just ask the first one, and maybe Katrina or no, let's go with Rico. Rico, you're not muted, and I'll ask you the first question. What is it like to be in the North as a 2S LGBTQ young person? And you can share as much as little as you want.
Okay, for sure. Living in the North as a 2S LGBTQ plus person, it can be very lonesome way up here because there are lack of, open spaces where people can gather, like such as gay bars or community events, or just place where we can just amalgamate together and bring stories together and share. So I think in terms of that, that's where we see like lack of I guess support from other areas in the province. Yeah.
Okay. Miigwech, Rico. Katrina, what is it like being LGBTQ and Two-Spirit in Northern Ontario?
Yeah, sorry. So I also grew up in a really small town, population under 1,000. So for me, growing up in the north, like Rico, there was a big lack of resources, but there was also a lack of safety and community. It wasn't necessarily safe to be out. My high school received death threats because they put up a rainbow flag in the office. So like those experiences kind of shaped me. And a lot of the people I grew up with just didn't stay. Everyone leaves. A lot of people go south because they just feel like they can't get that acceptance up here, even though it is changing slowly. There's still a lot of ignorance.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a very similar case, like right around like Northern Ontario and rural Ontario. I know Rico, you're up in Dryden, Ontario, so I know for some folks there, they also go. There's more of a calling for the West because Winnipeg is a little bit closer, and there's more of a LGBTQ community there as well. Or like Thunder Bay, if you're trying to look more central. I know with Katrina, you're in North Bay, so Sudbury does have a larger LGBTQ community too. So depending on where you're situated in Ontario, but I think for a lot of folks, it's always like down to Toronto and trying to get to the GTA, right? So, what from the recommendations, the 7 recommendations that were shared in the report, which one of those recommendations really speak to you, or do you think that is really important to you? And maybe Katrina, did you want to go take this one on?
Sure. So my personal favorite recommendation, I guess you could say, would be recommendation number 2, which is about the suburbs and rural areas, and just about intentionally dedicating resources and funding to directly support 2SLGBTQ youth, because that's something that I feel like we've really not come very far in, at least in my area. Anyways, I mean, North Bay's made great strides, but a lot of the smaller communities around here, like Sturgeon Falls or Englehart, New Liskeard, they don't have that same access to resources. And a lot of people even have to go to like Toronto just to see a doctor who's educated on trans health, or to receive, or they have to have, I mean, everyone's doing mostly telehealth and call appointments for mental health, but like it had to be someone from Toronto because people up here just aren't educated on the different issues and struggles that you face as a 2SLGBTQ youth. So.
Okay, Miigwech, Katrina. Rico, which one of those recommendations really speak to you?
Well, for me personally, I think all the recommendations are valid. Just maybe a couple that do speak out to me is the recommendations number 7, comprehension of ongoing training. I think training will play a huge factor. Ongoing training will play a huge factor in terms of people getting a better understanding on understanding homophobia and biphobia and all those phobias that they do exist, and they do play a huge impact on the youth and us as adults as well. It's one thing to put on a one-day training for 6 hours, and then after that, what happens? Usually, a lot of the times after the training day, a lot of the information that they retain kind of just sort of dissipates and it's gone. And then, whenever there is a crisis with a youth that identifies as, a person on the spectrum, the person that did the 6-hour training 3 months ago might not remember everything that they were trained on. So I think ongoing training is definitely something that that should be happening right now. And all healthcare, child welfare, and all these major places. Thanks.
Yeah. No, I think you really hit some really good points there. There's a lot of training that needs to be done right across the board in many different sectors for folks to start practicing those that advocacy or that allyship towards Two-Spirit LGBTQ people. So some very good points there as well. And also I agree that I think that all the recommendations are also important too. But I just say thank you for both of your insights on that. For the next question, 2SLGBTQ plus youth spaces in the North are so often white. How does that impact Indigenous and racialized youth? Rico, did you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I did attend the GSA in Sioux Lookout, and it was predominantly Caucasian. There were some First Nations in there, which I was really happy to see, but there wasn't a lot of content towards Two-Spirit or Indigenous people identifying on the spectrum. So I think, when developing a curriculum for GSA groups or 2SLGBTQ plus safety spaces, there should be some acknowledgement to First Nation and Two-Spirit people so that there is some inclusion for everybody at those spaces.
So really like carving out and acknowledging basically the importance for BIPOC inclusion or Black, Indigenous and people.
Yeah, yes, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, okay, that's great. No, because I guess I sometimes see that too, where people are like, oh, we're inclusive for everybody. I'm like, okay, like how, who in that everybody
Yeah,
we're all
right.
speaking to, because there's some people I might not always feel comfortable with, depending on what their viewpoints are. So yeah, so that's definitely a good point. Katrina.
Yeah, so again, I agree with Rico. I also want to add that I also see a lot of spaces that take the we're inclusive of everybody, and they push it to the limit. We're inclusive of that racist guy. We're inclusive of, the girl who uses slurs all the time and thinks it's funny. And we create spaces where it's safe for them. And it's like, by doing that, you're inherently creating spaces where it's not safe for other people. So acknowledging that, and at the very least, knowing when your space, because it can be very hard to create a space, especially in a mostly white community that is actually safe for BIPOC people. And I think it's very important to acknowledge if your space isn't safe, to know that and be able to say you know what, this is a really white space. You're welcome to come, but you might not be comfortable here. And here's why. We have people and we accept people who say and do these things. And maybe when you frame it that way to yourself, you'll also realize why you shouldn't accept people who do those things. But I really see the we accept everybody, or we don't see color, and it's that's a problem though. That's a really big problem. Yeah, or you find spaces where it's there are some Indigenous folks there, but they're mostly like me, so white passing. So the people in the groups don't necessarily code us as Indigenous right away. And then when they do, it becomes a problem when they catch on. And it's oh, you didn't realize. Now this space is definitely no longer safe.
No, I think that's very fair, and I know that's something that I know that I've experienced as well when you go into different spaces, and there's certain the energy kind of changes when you come out as something else that other people didn't actually know that you were, right? Doing workshops and a lot of times working with youth and in high schools, I would always ask the question is what does an LGBTQ person look like? and they can look like anybody like on this panel. And then, but it's like also what is a person of color or a Black or Indigenous person look like, and then they too can also experience and also look like anybody within this panel or in those places that we're a part of. The question I wasn't asking over all those years when I was facilitating though, is what does a racist person look like? What does a homophobic and trans person look like? And what does somebody who doesn't value Indigenous people look like? And unfortunately, those people also look like people that we share spaces with. So I think that's also when it comes down to building that acknowledgement, there's like, okay, we're a safe space for everybody. Okay, but you need to understand that some spaces aren't always as safe as for other folks. And I think that's what we're trying to get at. That so your inclusive spaces, your umbrella is still leaving people out. And you're just hiding behind an umbrella. Ella. Okay?
A.
Okay. So silly. Oh my gosh. I keep on thinking about when we went to Georgian Bay Powwow a couple of years ago. It was so much fun.
I know, it was so long ago. I'm like, that's the last time I went to a powwow.
Speaking of white spaces, remember that Dairy Queen? Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, next question. That's a good segue. Can you share how you've been involved with advocacy for change in your own community? And you can you can be as thorough or as descriptive as you like. Who would like to go first?
Okay.
Rico, you go first.
So I want to say I am trying, but at the same time, just due to COVID and my mental health, I haven't really been doing much advocacy for our community as of lately. And even then, before COVID hit, I just don't want to be, because there are not too many out people in this region, and I just don't want to be tokenized and be that person that everybody turns to for answers, because I don't have all the answers. Sometimes I just I feel like everybody else in that way. Though at work, I'm really surprised that they are starting up a 2SLGBTQ plus committee. And then here's my internal thoughts and feelings like, oh my God, I'm getting tokenized. But you know what? I can use it for the better good, for education, I hope I would have some influence in who sits on the committee, because I know there are a lot more people like me, like us, but they're not out. They're still in the closet. And you know what? That's okay. If that's where they feel safe right now, then, I would like to respect that. But I think, hopefully I would have some influence and use it on the committee in terms of moving forward with bringing awareness, especially for a child welfare agency. I'm really surprised that one particular community, I'm not going to mention it just for confidentiality, but one predominantly Christian community, their foster parents are actually a lot more open to learning more about 2SLGBTQ plus youth and everything involved in that. And I think that's a huge step forward in making a change. So I'm happy to be part of the committee, even if I am a little tokenized. It's okay if they don't say it. I know it, I'm aware, but I hope to bring awareness and more education to the other communities as much as I can. Because I do know that there are a lot of Two-Spirit youth in our communities that are struggling right now because they don't have a safe space, they don't have somebody to talk to, and just even accessing resources, online, that can be dangerous too, right? Because parents could be searching through history, like, why are you looking at this? Or, there's lack of resources and books, even lack of internet too. So
No,
if I can make a change, I'll make a change that way.
No, and I do want to say, like, I apologize if it is like a tokenization type of role within the community. But if it is, I hope they're giving you a bunch of tokens and paying you accordingly.
Yeah. Give me that money.
Rain on me. Katrina, what about yourself? Can you share anything of how you've been involved in advocacy within your community?
Well, to be honest, recently I have also taken a step back just because of COVID, and also, not to name names, there's a certain group in North Bay who I don't necessarily agree with, but who is also offering a space for 2SLGBTQ youth that they wouldn't otherwise have without them. So it's a delicate balance there, and that's kind of been part of my decision to take a step back and just not really involve myself right now with COVID. Previous to that, in 2019, I was a youth ambassador with YouthLine. So I helped with doing the needs assessment for the recommendations report, and I got to meet a whole bunch of cool folks all over the Northeast, and do some community sharing circles and facilitate some group meetings and art stuff, and it was super awesome. And just building that, and we created a zine, which I think has been linked, and that was super awesome and fun. And unfortunately, after that, the space that is run by people whose names I won't be mentioning and whose space I won't be mentioning opened up, and it just kind of created a weird vibe. So took a step back.
No, and I can understand that too. And sometimes that does happen with like different pride movements or LGBTQ movements, like throughout the North. Sometimes if somebody has like either more capacity or they have like additional resource to offer, but then it's also like different moral challenge or ethical challenges also on top of that. They're like, okay, well, thank you for your kindness and your generosity, but I don't think I agree on this process or the behavior, or can't tolerate what's something that's happening here on the other side. Because that's also happened here in the community that I'm a part of as well, where different like leaderships changed over time, and people are like, okay, we're going to give this person a chance, and they're going to try and lead, and they're like, okay, how do we take it back? How do we stop them now? And it's like, okay, so then how do you work as a community to address those issues, if you can, if it's a possibility? So, and maybe that kind of goes to our final question here for the panel before we turn it to audience questions, is what are one or two changes that could be made right now to support 2SLGBTQ youth in the North and in rural communities? Who would like to take a shot at that? I have people yelling in the parking lot next to me. I'm so sorry, I'm distracted.
That's all right. I had to switch to headphones because the people in my building are being very loud today. So I can empathize with that. I think one or two changes that would be a really great help would be increased medical advocacy for trans youth and just 2SLGBTQ youth in general. I mean, sex ed in the North is kind of meh anyways, but especially sex ed for people who are not having sex with people who have different genitals than they do, if that's a thing, or who are having sex with more than one person at the same time, and what kind of safety that looks like. And I think just having people who are well educated on that and who can bring a non-judgmental vibe to that space would be really beneficial. And I also think creating more group spaces for youth would also be helpful, online or in person. Well, not in person right now, but online.
No, and I think that's very fair, and I agree when it comes to like more advocacy for trans healthcare in the North. There's a Two-Spirit person by the name of Dr. James McFocus. So them and their partner Anthony Johnson, they were the winners of Canada's Amazing Race, and then so they do, and they practice medicine in Alberta, where they're from. But actually, I spoke with them on a panel a couple of months ago, and they're actually going to be working with CAMH, whether you like them or whether you're not. But they're going to be working with CAMH and trying to develop a telehealth project or plan for people in Northern Ontario to get access to trans health care. So keep an eye out for that. So
Ooh, that's exciting.
Rico, what were one or two changes you'd like to see in the North or in rural communities?
Well, I definitely do agree with Katrina. I think there needs to be more advocacy for the healthcare in that aspect. But I think we can. What else I would like is more webinars for youth to access online, because we do know a lot of youth do connect on their iPods, laptops, or whatever communicational device they have, and kind of just, bringing them together in an online community. And this can sort of segue into, as soon as COVID subsides, it can sort of transition or segue into like in-person community events and circles and stuff like that. Anyway, that's what I was thinking of last minute.
No, I like that. I like that. There's some really good examples and some really good things and some goals to look forward to in the future. Maybe, hopefully, cross your fingers.
Yes.
Cross your legs. Cross your eyes. So yeah, so I think at this point in time, I would like to open up to Haley to see if there's any questions from the audience that are coming in.
Actually, we have a very quiet group today, so we're not actually seeing any questions come in yet. So just a reminder for folks, if you do have questions for any of us here, including us behind the scenes from YouthLine, please ask them in the Q&A chat. But also, I actually have a follow-up question to the three of you that I'm hoping you might be able to answer. So I mentioned previously when I was sharing the recommendations that one of the questions from our original needs assessment was, if you could say anything to those who are in positions of power, what would you say? So I actually want to pose the same question to three of you. Just to say, like, what if you could say anything to those who are specifically in elected positions, whether that be federal, provincial, local, whatever, what would you say to them if you could say anything?
Well, I know that we're almost going to go into like provincial elections next year, and we almost had a federal election with that budget a little while ago, so it was kind of scary. But I think I always try to post on social media to like people who are thinking of running when it comes to election season, is like, don't come talk to me about LGBTQ issues during election season if you haven't talked to me throughout the entire 4 years since the last election. So, because I don't care unless you're there, if you're interested beforehand. So I would say just don't come knocking on my door during election season asking about LGBTQ issues. That's what I would say.
I like that.
Katrina or Rico?
I'm actually just gonna skip this question. Sorry, Katrina, or sorry, Haley. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Katrina,
Yeah.
do you have an answer?
Okay. If I had something to say to people who were elected, it would probably be to remember that people who don't live in cities are still people. There are Indigenous people in northern communities that you don't give enough accessibility to for voting, enough options to, enough language accessibility so that they can make informed choices. Even if it's just an informed choice to not vote, they should have that like option presented to them in their own language. And to remember that like taking care of the land and its people is what what builds this community that we have together as a nation and as a province. So if you can't do that, then you're never going to make it that far. You're never going to be able to plan long term.
I think that's a really good. Thank you, Katrina. We do have some questions here in the Q&A. So I'm just trying to get them. Maybe I'll start here. The first one, a rural social worker here within high schools. In addition to GSAs, we're hoping to run 2S LGBTQ plus peer-led groups and meeting spaces. Wondering what your thoughts are regarding location and timing in order to be accessible to students. Any ideas or thoughts?
I'm wondering if it could be like within school hours, because I know that sometimes if it's after school, some youth may not feel comfortable leaving school at a certain time because maybe they could be targeted, you know, because like, oh, you went to a GSA class, you know, whatever. Because I know some kids, there's a lot of bullying in high school. So I'm just wondering if it could be like sort of like discreet, but not discreet during school hours. Just my opinion anyway. Maybe Katrina might have something else to say or not.
I typed in an answer from me. But I basically just said that what's accessible for people just really depends on the people and the area. So it's really hard to kind of narrow that down. Something to consider is that there are folks who won't be able to access something that's after school. Time-wise, there are folks who won't be able to access something that's at school because the school just might not be a safe environment for them to come out in for whatever reason. And it just really depends on what group of people you want who want to be involved and what their limits are. You know, there could be financial limits, there could be actual like physical accessibility issues, and all kinds of things. Accessibility means different things to so many different people. So having those conversations and those nuanced details with the youth is where you're really going to get the answer to make those decisions.
And thank you for the response, Katrina. And I wanted to direct this next question to you as well. Amanda Trudeau is hoping to honor Pride Month with their health promotion team, and they want to know what are some major topics that they could address for LGBTQ folks in healthcare.
Accessibility is probably the big one. Physical accessibility, especially in northern communities on reserves. I mean, some reserves don't even have clinic or doctor access for hours. Like hours of travel, and that costs money. It costs time to apply for travel grants if that's something they need. So really taking into consideration and talking about all the different ways that people can become non-compliant when it comes to taking care of their health, both physically and mentally, just because they don't have access to the things they need to take the steps that are best for them.
Rico, did you want to mention anything when it comes to like for healthcare?
Not right now, sorry.
No, okay, fair. Okay, so Karen has asked. Oh, sorry, Haley.
I'm just noticing the time, and I'm wondering if we want to wrap up with just one final question that I wanted to pose to the three of you, if you want to respond, but also anyone else behind the scenes. I know I said a couple minutes ago, I'm like, there's no questions, and now there's all the questions coming in. But one that I find comes up a lot in this type of work and doing like 2SLGBTQ plus youth work, youth organizing, whatever, and 2SLGBTQ culture and like services being like centered in Toronto. So I guess my question is just like what, and someone else had posted as well, is like what is the impact of that, or like what are the similarities and differences of like existing as a 2S LGBTQ person in northern and or rural Ontario in comparison to being in like larger urban spaces like Toronto, which has like, so I'm not going to say enough resources, there'll never be enough resources, but like is so well resourced in comparison to like smaller communities and northern communities. So just wanted to know if anyone wanted to kind of touch on that, what the impact is. I know that we've had conversations too about leaving home communities to go to the city. I feel like most of us actually have experience with that. Yeah, so just wanted to pose that question if there's any thoughts around Toronto, or as someone has named it before as Toronto propaganda, Toronto queer propaganda. So I'll leave that to the three of you and anyone else, I guess.
Well, I haven't lived in Toronto before, but I did live in Winnipeg. And I do know that there was a lot of resources, like there was a GSA group, several GSA groups. There was safe spaces for youth to attend to where they like have board games, drag night, movie night, arts and crafts, DJing. I thought there was a lot of inclusion for LGBT youth in Winnipeg. And then when I came out here to Northwestern Ontario, there was a lack of resources. Just the one GSA group in Sioux Lookout. I do know that though there's not a lot of I don't know how to say it, but I think there's a bit more acceptance in Sioux Lookout for people on the LGBT spectrum, because I do see there are people like transitioning people, you know, walking about in Sioux Lookout, and they're perfectly normal and fine the way they are. There's no slurs or anything uttered at them, and I think they feel safe in Sioux Lookout being who they are. Yeah, and I think that's, I don't know, despite the lack of resources, I think it's a safe space for people to be who they are in Sioux Lookout anyway. Which was kind of nice that I observed over the past couple of years.
Katrina, did you want to mention anything?
Yeah. So I'm never going to live down referring to Toronto propaganda as Toronto propaganda, which was a comment I specifically made about YouthLine, but which applies to the queer community as well. In that there are a lot of queer folks, LGBT folks, who see how accessible things are in Toronto and then have this idea that things are accessible everywhere because they're accessible in a bigger city. So resources, I don't want to say it takes away from resources, but nobody thinks about adding resources north of that. Or they're like, oh, you know, Toronto's not that far. And they forget that, you know, Sioux Lookout is still in Ontario. Kenora is still in Ontario. Those are northern cities. They are very far from Toronto. Even Thunder Bay, which does have a much better, like, not much better, I should say, but like a pretty thriving LGBT community in itself, is still a long, like, what, 14, 15 hours from Toronto? Something like that, far. And Timmins, all of those northern, northwestern places that just don't have access to the same level of resources that you get in Toronto, because there's just not that same level of population density. And people in Toronto just don't think about that either, because they've gotten access to resources in Toronto, whether they moved or they were able to fly, or CAMH worked well for them and they got, you know, that kind of access to those resources. So it just creates this idea that, oh yes, there's resources, there's so many resources, when in fact there is many resources available in the city of Toronto, some of which are available province-wide, depending on how accessible and your accessibility needs are, and how accessible they are to you. For people who live in really rural communities and don't have internet, a lot of like CAMH's teleconference stuff isn't accessible. You know, they can talk on the phone, but they can't do any like video chat appointments. And that's just, you know, one example off the top of my head. So I think that's something that really affects it, is this, it becomes this almost dynamic view of like, everything's available in Toronto and Toronto only, instead of being like, we've created these great resources in one city, so how do we get them in all the others?
Yeah. No, and I think for myself, is like, I think I like seeing the progress that's being happening in rural communities and northern communities, because I think for like the past like 15 or 20 years, you could hear service providers, you hear communities like, well, we're not Toronto. Well, this isn't Toronto. This is the North. We have our own needs. We're not Toronto. And people are realizing like, okay, so we're not Toronto, but we still have 2SLGBTQ people And so what are their needs and how can we meet some of those needs? So if you go to some of those smaller prides, like in Cochrane or Red Lake, Ontario, or Walpole Island First Nation or Ngodranong and Peterborough, there's a lot of heart in those communities. And I'm not saying that there's no heart in Toronto. I'm just saying that heart's a little bit more like a pacemaker. It's buried. It's deep under like a big old machine. And so I like seeing those smaller communities and saying like we're not Toronto. We're Red Lake, we're Sault Ste. Marie, we're Sudbury, we're North Bay, we're Timmins, we're Walpole Island, we're Ngodranong, we're Bawating, and all those places who are showing their own pride in their own way. Sioux Lookout, Dryden, Kenora, and there's a lot more places now than from when I was a kid, like 15 years ago, when I remember there was a Toronto Pride, something in Thunder Bay, and a Sudbury Pride, and a gay bar in Sudbury. And that was basically all the gay resources I knew in Ontario and Northern Ontario. So we've come a long way from that. So I do want to say chimigwech to Katrina and Rico for being those resources and being that change in your own communities. It's an honor to know you and it's an honor to work with you and call you colleagues and friends. So, and thank you to YouthLine and to Haley and Burka and to the team for inviting us here today. So it's been a joy. It's been real.
This was lovely. Thank you so much to all three of you for sharing your experiences and thoughts and the advocacy work you've been involved in. This conversation has been really lovely. And I want to have more of them. But we are running out of time. There's only a couple minutes left. So just want to go over some next steps for folks that are out there in the audience. So what do we do now after this webinar? Step number 1, please fill out our survey. So we have a survey. The survey is about feedback about this event, yes, but actually mostly about our next steps as an organization in terms of doing this type of advocacy work. So how can we support your organizations or your services or whatever, and actually implementing these recommendations? What recommendations would be the most challenging to implement? Like, we just ask lots of great questions because we really just want your feedback about what to do next and how to support. Step number 2, share the report. Please share it everywhere. Share it with your colleagues, your friends, your family, on Facebook, on Instagram, like wherever. Just share it around, please. We've been getting lots of questions about if we've shared this report with politicians. The answer is yes, but also we want you to share it with your local politicians, your provincial politicians, the federal politicians, whoever, all of the people in positions of power, share it because we are doing that work, but we want you to do that work too. Step number 3, order YouthLine outreach materials. So for folks that don't know, there's a link on our website that I think is going to be shared in the chat for anyone who does work with 2SLGBTQ young people or young people in general. You can order our resources for our peer support line. We've got posters, we've got little business cards, we've got our needs assessment reports. You can order all of those for free. We will mail them right to you. So please go do that. And the 4th thing, add your organization or supports to our resource database. So YouthLine does have a front-facing resource database where you can enter in your program information, your organizational information, whatever. If you support 2SLGBTQ young folks, we want your resource on that database. That is what we use for our peer support line. And it's what other services use. It's what youth use when trying to access services. So please include your information. And something I didn't include here as a next step is like work really hard to implement these recommendations, please. That's like, feels like it should be the most obvious one, but we didn't create this report. The youth didn't go through all of this work and all of this advocacy, this launch tour, our launch tour last year for the needs assessment reports, for this recommendations report just to be out there on the internet and not used. Like, please, please, please find ways to implement these in your organization, in your group, whatever, and do some of that advocacy work with us, please. And then also one other thing, it was just mentioned in the chat, we are hiring 2 coordinator positions currently for our Provincial Youth Ambassador project. So if you know young folks that are 2SLGBTQ+, particularly in Northern and rural Ontario, please pass along that job posting to them. We are absolutely prioritizing folks coming from Northern Ontario for both of those positions. And it's 1:59, yes, on time. So I think that wraps everything up for the day. Thank you so much to everyone who is in the audience, who came here to support and to listen and to learn. Thank you so much to Rico and Katrina and Teddy for all of the amazing things that you said today and all the advocacy work all three of you are doing continuously. Even if you think you're not, you absolutely are. And thanks to Anu for sharing these recommendations with me and to everyone behind the scenes. So with that, I think we'll close for today. Thanks again, everyone. Please check out our website and email if you have any questions or want to chat. Everyone has a good rest of your day. Bye.
Bye, Bama.